Heir to the Empire by Timothy Zahn. Zahn got the offer from his editor for a 3-book saga set after Return of the Jedi in November of 1989. In the foreword to the 20th anniversary edition of Heir to the Empire, he says that he has no idea why he was chosen, but nevertheless, he was very excited to get to play in the Star Wars sandbox, and he turned in the draft to what would be Heir to the Empire in November of 1990. Neither of his original titles were used for the book. He originally thought of calling it either Wild Card or The Emperor's Hand, but Bantam eventually gave it to the title of Heir to the Empire. A few of his more eccentric decisions were changed, perhaps not in the writing period, but in the planning period, in that Joruus C'baoth was originally planned to be an evil clone of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the Noghri initially were going to be the Sith. Apparently they were going to be a species. But anyway, it was published in May of 1991. It made it to number 1 on the New York Times bestseller lists on the week of June 30th, and ultimately was on the New York Times bestseller list for 19 weeks, which was pretty amazing for a book that was being sold for less than the price of many other hardcover books at the time. My hardcover copy shows that it's $15, which was pretty cheap. Heir to the Empire ran out of its first run in 2 weeks. I think initially they printed 70,000 books and they were just flying off the shelf. So in doing this series, I both wanted to look at the book from a critical point of view, but also look at the book from a nostalgic point of view. So my first thought was, before I start reading each of these, that I should think about what I remember the books being about. And I remembered this book being about actually what was half of the book. My memories of the book were very clear of when Luke is on Merkur with Card and Mara Jade and the rest of them, but that doesn't happen till halfway through, and there was a lot of stuff at the beginning that I had completely forgotten about. So, a brief synopsis. It is 5 years after Return of the Jedi. Princess Leia and Han Solo are married, and they are expecting twins. The New Republic has its capital on Coruscant, and they are currently being governed by a provisional council, which includes Leia, Mon Mothma, Admiral Akbar, and a Bothan named Borsk Thalia. Presumably there are other members of the provisional council as well, but we are never given their names. Over on the Imperial side, Grand Admiral Thrawn, who is a mysterious blue-skinned, red-eyed alien, is making a push to regain ground that the Empire has lost. And there's a smuggler named Talon Card, who has a second-in-command named Mara Jade, who has a mysterious past, I guess you would call it, with the Empire and with Luke Skywalker in particular. So, my thoughts. I actually really love this book. I find it very easy to read and very easy to get into, and more so than some of the other Bantam books that were released, it sort of has that space opera vibe. On the other hand, something that I probably would not have noticed, except for the fact that around Christmas time I read the 3 new Thrawn books that Zahn had released, was that there's a distinct lack of women, at least in this Thrawn trilogy compared to the new ones. There's a throwaway line in the first chapter when Captain Plean is thinking about how the Empire has changed since the Battle of Endor, and he has a line where he talks about that the Chimera, Grand Admiral Thrawn's flagship, is almost solely populated by young men and women. But then we're not given an example of a single young woman who works in any capacity in the Imperial fleet. Talon Card second in command, Mara Jade, is obviously a woman, but though we're given names of other male smugglers that he works with, the only female smuggler that we have any interaction with is solely in the chapter when they pick up Luke's stranded, broken X-Wing, and she's not even given a name. And on the Republic side, we have Winter, Princess Leia's personal assistant, and obviously Leia and Mon Mothma, but that's it. It just strikes me as strange that in a galaxy where presumably there was gender parity of both alien and human species, that we just see so very few women. Growing up reading these books, I loved the strong characters like Leia and Mara, but I'm wondering now if I love them so much because they were the only female characters there. I also wanted to, for nostalgia's sake, keep a track record of all the different outfits and hairdos that Princess Leia sports throughout the Bantam era. And I have to say, Zahn, you disappointed me. Obviously, Leia is sporting a lovely Endor hairdo on this cover, but we don't get a description of any of her outfits or her hairdos, which I know is not at all important to the plot, but we get like several descriptions of what Luke is wearing. I start to say, where's the pretty outfits? Where's the braided hairdos? That's what I am looking for in a Star Wars piece of fiction. I find Mara Jade an interesting character. There are aspects of her which clearly come from the old Marvel comics, in that Shira Bray was also a beautiful, green-eyed, red-haired lady who was secretly working for the Empire and wanted to kill Luke Skywalker. But I find Mara's arc in these books more interesting than what happened with Shira. At this point in the story, she's not at all presented as a romantic interest for Luke, but rather she's someone who is, if not highly placed in the Empire, felt like she was, had a job that she was very good at, and then with the Battle of Endor and the death of the Emperor and Darth Vader, she no longer has a place in the Empire, and she takes all of her anger and frustration about that out on Luke, perhaps understandably. It's not until later books that we get a little bit more elaboration on her issues, especially in Dark Force Rising. At this point, there's no mention of the Emperor's last command, but I find her interesting because she's bitter and grouchy, but she's also hyper-competent, which I really appreciate. And I appreciated when I read these at the time I originally did. I also have to say that I feel like later authors, and especially in the comics, they didn't quite know what to do with Mara. She's sort of just this sexy black leather catsuit figure, which you never really get a sense of from these books. First of all, she never wears a sexy black leather catsuit, but more that her dancer's grace to me indicates someone who's very athletic and not someone who's bursting out of black leather. Grand Admiral Thrawn's an interesting creation as well. In this book, he is distinctly a bad guy. He has a member of his crew killed in front of everyone because he made a mistake. He considers killing Luke Skywalker at one point rather than turning him over to C'baoth. And it's interesting to compare his portrayal in this book with both his portrayal in later expanded universe works as well as his portrayal in the new canon. In the new canon in particular, he is very much more of an anti-hero, whereas in the original Thrawn trilogy, he's just a straight-up villain. He's definitely got that Sherlock Holmes vibe in that he figures things out, and then Captain Palayan, as Watson, is left to say, "But how did you do it?" But more if Sherlock were definitely evil and I were not quite supposed to root for him. I was also a little surprised by the end. I think I conflated it with the ending of Dark Force Rising in that it was a definite failure for the New Republic, but a victory for the Empire. Although I guess it sort of is a victory more on Thrawn's side than anyone else. He attacks the Sluice Spawn shipyards because he wants ships. He doesn't get ships, but I guess he gets the consolation prize of, well, I messed up all their stuff, ha ha ha. Joris Truboth, I find an uninteresting character, and I think it's just because all we know about him at this point is that he's a clone, he doesn't know he's a clone, he wants power, that's it. I sort of wonder what an evil clone of Obi-Wan would have looked like, but I'm not sure I would have liked that portrayal any better than Truboth's portrayal. And I also find that just the character of Truboth opens up this can of worms regarding the Clone Wars, which is, at this point, before Lucas had decided that he was going to do the prequel trilogy, all we knew about the Clone Wars was that they happened at some point, there were clones. And Zahn's interpretation is that the first clones were mentally unstable, that it was this super bad thing. And though he doesn't come out and say that the clones were fighting for the Empire or the Republic, you sort of get the sense that the clones were on the bad side. And then you also get the sense that the Clone Wars is something farther back than it ended up being, which I think it partially is George Lucas's decision to make Anakin be really, really young when he turns to Darth Vader. Whereas the feeling I got from the original trilogy and from this book is that the Clone Wars is something that happened like 40 years before A New Hope, and Anakin's transformation into Darth Vader happened at some point after the Clone Wars. Whereas in Return of the Sith, it's sort of like Clone Wars, end of Clone Wars, Darth Vader, Empire, and it just happens all at once. I find that Zahn has a sort of, I don't want to say pedestrian style, but he's not writing literary fiction here. So you don't get particularly flowery or purple descriptions of anything. And the dialogue sometimes, I feel, relies a little too closely on what we remember from the original trilogy. You'll have characters thinking of, oh, when we escaped from the Death Star, or people will make comments like Han says, sorry, I couldn't consult a committee, and Leia goes, I'm not a committee, and Luke goes, I don't understand that joke. Which, I know that they're there to pull people into the story. So they're like, oh, this is a Star Wars story. It's just like those movies. But then there's a part of me that goes, what, the characters really constantly referencing the same 3 events? Like, surely they've lived through other things and they have other points of references. But I can't get too ticked about it because obviously you have to start from somewhere. I really love, though, Zahn's portrayal of Leia and Han's relationship. They don't always spend a lot of time together, mostly because of plot reasons, but I feel like you can see why they're still together. Something that in some of the books you wonder, like, why are these people still together? They're just constantly doing other things. And I get more of a sense here that both Leia wants to be trained as a Jedi, and she wants to take less time with her diplomatic stuff. And also that the only reason they're not spending loads of time right now is because, demands of their job, and that when they get the opportunity, they will, which I like. It's nice seeing a relationship like that. And then what about Luke? I don't know. I have a soft spot for Zahn's portrayal of Luke. In some of the later Bantam books, he starts to get really overpowered. In the same way that I don't like the duels in the prequel trilogy as much as I like the duel in, say, the end of The Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi. Because I feel like when the Jedi start to do these really super overpowered things, I start to lose that suspension of disbelief. It's like, I can buy that someone's fighting with a lightsaber and someone can do flippy flips, but when they start doing flippy flips everywhere, my brain starts going, wait a minute. So I appreciate that Luke, you know, he has issues in this book. Ben Kenobi says that he won't be able to see him anymore. He hasn't figured anything out. He can't get time to train his sister, and then he's stuck for half the book on a planet where he can't even use the Force. So it's a nice way to have Luke there, but like keep putting these obstacles in his path that he has to deal with. I guess my main criticism is I feel like some parts of the book, it's not a particularly long book, but some parts probably could have been cut. I feel like Luke going to Dagobah and finding the beacon call is just an excuse to get him with Lando and Leia and Han at the same time, and like maybe they just send him a message or something. In the same way that I think it's important to show multiple attempts on the Nogri's side to kidnap, so to speak, Leia and Luke, but I think the one on Bimasari is more important and comes off better than the one on that other planet, which I'm not going to try to pronounce because there's a B and an F together. You end up with 3 attempts to kidnap Leia and just really 1 to kidnap Luke, and I think it probably could have been streamlined a little. I also wish that maybe we could have seen a little bit more of Han's attempts to talk to the other smugglers. We see him talk to Dravis, and then we see him talk to one of Card's associates before he and Lando come to Merker. But, I don't know. I like Han hanging out in sleazy cantinas, you know, trying to talk to someone, and they're all like, oh, but I don't know what side you're on. I do appreciate bringing Lando along for the journey, though, because I love Lando. He's possibly my favorite. I will forever approve of any attempt to bring Lando into anything, no matter how stupid it is. Corellian Trilogy. So, in short, Heir to the Empire. If you're looking into reading the 90s Bantam-era Star Wars books, this is a great introduction. It introduces you to a lot of characters that get reused over and over again in the books, most specifically Talon Card, Mara Jade, and Grand Admiral Thrawn. It's exciting. It's not literary fiction, but I mean, come on. There's the guy shooting lightning out of his fingertips. You're not expecting that when you go into this book. And I think that the trilogy as a whole, while I know a lot of people were talking about it as, oh, they wanted that to be the sequel trilogy. Look, it's a book series. It's obviously not, you know, a screenplay, and it would be really hard to adapt it to a screenplay. I mean, they just go to so many places. But I love it for the way that it brought Star Wars back into the mainstream, and I just love it because it's a fun story. You know, it's cliched, but it's fun. Sometimes all I want is a stupid fun read, and that is what this provided me with. So next up, Dark Force Rising, which I hope is full of dark forces rising.